The San Bernardino Mountains do not care about your intentions or your level of preparation. They sit like a jagged spine of sun-bleached granite and dried pine needles under the oppressive, suffocating weight of the Southern California sun. Up there, the air is thin enough to make your heart hammer against your ribs like a panicked bird trapped in a cage of bone. Most people look at the peak of Mount San Gorgonio and see a weekend challenger trail to be conquered for the sake of a photograph. I see a digestive tract. It is a landscape that swallows the unwary and the slow, grinding them down into the dirt until there is nothing left but a fading memory and a few scattered pieces of plastic. 12-year-old Jared Negrete was not a mountain climber by nature or by build. He was a boy with thick glasses and a gentle, quiet disposition, carrying the weight of a world he had not yet learned to navigate with confidence. In July of 1991, he joined his Boy Scout troop for what should have been a routine character-building ascent of the highest peak in the region. The trail was a vertical graveyard of loose scree and ancient, fallen timber that crunched under heavy hiking boots. Jared was struggling from the start, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps as the group pushed higher into the thin, oxygen-starved atmosphere. He was falling behind a small and solitary figure, becoming increasingly microscopic against the indifferent scale of the wilderness. The scoutmaster made a decision at 10,000 feet that would haunt every remaining hour of his natural life. Jared was exhausted, his legs shaking with the effort of the climb, and the final push for the summit loomed ahead like a wall of grey stone. The leader told the boy to stay put, to sit on a specific log near the trail, and wait for the rest of the group to return from the peak. It seemed like a logical choice at the time, a simple matter of a few thousand yards and an hour of patience. But the woods have a peculiar way of shifting their geometry when you turn your back on someone. The silence at that altitude is not peaceful. It is a physical weight that presses against your eardrums until you begin to hear things that are not there. When the troop descended from the summit a few hours later, the log was empty and the silence was absolute. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the dry earth, and no scuffed dirt to indicate a fall down the steep embankment. Jared was simply gone as if he had been erased by a giant invisible thumb moving across the map of the world. The scoutmaster called out his name until his throat was raw, but the only response was the wind whistling through the stunted, twisted limbs of the limber pines. Panic began to settle into the marrow of their bones, a cold realization that the mountain had claimed a toll they were not prepared to pay. They searched until the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to reach out for the remaining boys. By the following morning, the mountain was crawling with a small army of searchers and specialized equipment. Over 3,000 individuals would eventually comb through the treacherous vertical terrain in search of a single 12-year-old boy. We are talking about helicopters equipped with high-resolution thermal imaging bloodhounds with noses tuned to the sharp scent of human fear and elite mountain rescue teams who knew every crevice of the granite. They found absolutely nothing for the first several days of the operation. No tracks, no bits of clothing caught on the thorny brush, and no response to the whistles and megaphones echoing through the deep canyons. It was as if the boy had stepped into a pocket of air and vanished from the physical realm entirely. Then the items began to appear in places that defied any conventional logic of travel. A backpack was discovered at the top of a steep, incredibly dangerous drainage area, far from the location where Jared was last seen. Later, a single shoe print was identified in the drying mud near a remote spring miles away from the established trail. Then came the candy wrappers, and a small empty bag of beef jerky discarded like breadcrumbs leading into a void. These clues did not lead the searchers to Jared. They only led to more horrifying questions about his movement. The items were found in areas that a 12-year-old boy with no survival training and poor eyesight should not have been able to reach on his own. The most haunting discovery of the entire 19-day ordeal was the camera. It was Jared's small, inexpensive plastic Kodak sitting in the dirt like a discarded toy in a place where no one expected it to be. When the investigators developed the film, they found a series of mundane landscape photos, the kind of pictures any boy would take on a scouting trip. But the final frame on the roll was different, and it chilled the blood of everyone who looked at it. It was a close-up of Jared's face, taken in the middle of the night by the harsh, blinding light of the flash. His glasses were missing, his face was smirched with dirt, and his eyes were wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. If you study that photograph long enough, you start to see things in the absolute blackness that surrounds his head. He was looking at something just beyond the reach of the light, or perhaps something was standing right behind him in the dark. Why would a lost, terrified child take a self-portrait in the dead of night while he was fighting for his life? Perhaps he heard something circling his makeshift camp and used the camera flash as a desperate weapon, a temporary shield against the encroaching dark. Or perhaps he wanted the world to have one last look at him, to know that he was still there, even as the cold began to shut down his vital organs. The photo is not just an image. It is a silent scream, frozen in silver halide. The terrain around Mount San Gorgonio is a labyrinthine mess of granite and high desert scrub. In many of these disappearances, we see a strange and consistent correlation with high concentrations of igneous rock. It is as if the stone itself holds a subtle electrical charge, an energy that interferes with the human inner ear and the sense of direction. Jared was moving through a landscape that seemed to be actively working against the efforts of the search teams. The rescuers reported strange weather patterns, sudden and thick fogs that rolled in out of nowhere to swallow the helicopters and ground the crews. It felt to some of the seasoned veterans as though the mountain was consciously protecting its prize from being recovered. There are whispers among the old-timers who spend too much of their lives in these high, lonely places. They talk about things that are not quite animals, and yet are not quite men, entities that move without making a sound on the forest floor. They speak of silent flyers and predators that can mimic the sound of a human voice to lure the unwary away from the safety of the group. Jared was a boy who followed the rules, a boy who was told to sit on a log and wait. And he would have stayed there unless something forced him to move. What could be so terrifying that it would drive a child to climb into the most inaccessible, dangerous parts of the mountain in the middle of the night? The silence of the wilderness is never truly empty. It is just waiting for the right moment to speak. After 19 days of intensive searching, the official operation was called off, and the mountain was left to the wind. The parents were left with a backpack, a few empty wrappers, and that haunting final image of their son's terrified face. No body was ever recovered from the slopes of San Gorgonio. No bones were ever found by hikers or hunters in the decades that followed, despite the area being heavily traveled. It is as if Jared Negrete was absorbed into the very granite of the mountain, becoming a permanent part of the landscape he was trying to conquer. The case remains a festering wound in the history of the San Bernardino National Forest, a mystery that refuses to provide the mercy of closure. This tragedy is not an isolated incident, but rather a single thread in a much larger and more disturbing tapestry of vanishings. The pattern repeats itself with a sickening regularity across the national parks and wilderness areas of North America. We see the same recurring elements. A sudden and inexplicable separation from a group, a strange lack of scent for the tracking dogs, and clothing or equipment found in impossible locations. It reminds me of the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the rugged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, or the vanishing of Danny Philippidis in the forests of New York. These people walk into the shadows of the trees and simply cease to exist in our version of reality. We spend our lives searching for footprints in the dirt, but we should be looking for the things that do not leave any tracks at all. The mountain still stands there today, massive and indifferent to the grief of the people who live in its shadow. If you hike the trails near the summit of San Gorgonio, you might feel a sudden chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air. You might feel the sensation of eyes watching you from the granite outcroppings, measuring your pace and your fatigue. Do not wander away from the group, and do not think that your technology will save you when the sun goes down. Some places on this earth are not meant for us, and they will remind us of that fact in the most brutal way imaginable. The story of Jared Negrete is a warning that the dark has a memory, and it never forgets the face of someone who is truly lost. The search for answers in these cases often leads to a wall of silence from the authorities and a lack of interest from the mainstream media. They prefer to label these events as simple accidents, the results of exposure, or animal attacks that leave no evidence behind. But those of us who look at the data know that there is something else happening in the high places of the world. There is a predatory element to the wilderness that we have forgotten in our modern, well-lit lives. We have traded our survival instincts for the comfort of a screen, and the mountain is always hungry for the next person who forgets to look behind them. Stay on the trail, keep your eyes on the horizon, and never ever go into the woods alone. The final image of Jared remains the most enduring mystery of the 1991 search. It serves as a grim reminder that the most terrifying things are often the ones we cannot see, the things that exist just beyond the circle of our light. When the flash went off that night, it captured a moment of pure existential dread that most of us will never have to experience. Jared was a boy who was lost in more than just the physical sense. He was lost in a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. We can only hope that wherever he is now, the light has finally found him. But the mountain is still there, and it is still waiting for the next hiker to fall behind. There is a chilling similarity between this case and the disappearance of young Bobby Beezup in 1958. Bobby was at a summer camp in the Rocky Mountains when he vanished while walking a short distance between buildings. Despite an exhaustive search, only a few fragments of his clothing and his hearing aid were found years later in a location that was deemed inaccessible. These cases suggest a predatory intelligence that targets the vulnerable and the isolated in our most sacred natural spaces. The pattern is there for anyone who is brave enough to look at the shadows and see what is looking back. The wilderness is not our friend, and it is certainly not our playground. It is a kingdom with its own dark and ancient laws.